Thanks for coming. Tonight we have our lead instructor. Many of you know him. I was going to say, here's a person that needs no introduction, just walk away. But I'm going to introduce him anyway. So, as you know, this year we kind of upped our game and we commissioned a workbook. Joshua R Brown, Dr. Joshua R Brown, as he makes me call him, was our lead instructor and our lead author on the workbook. So this year, he's representing something he presented last year with a lot of twists and turns. So without further ado, because Josh will run late, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Joshua R Brown.
Thank you, John. It's good to be back. You know, it's like a family reunion being back here. A lot of familiar faces, and we've missed you all too, you know. But anyway, so this session, I did do a bit of it last year, and so one of the big questions I think is like, well, how am I going to make this different? Because there'll be some people that came last year to the session, and some folks that maybe they're seeing it for the first time. And what's nice now is a lot of the things that I talked about in the last session are in the book. So I don't have to read you the book or talk about the book as much. You can refer to it and look at this particular chapter, which is, I think, the third chapter. Oh, second chapter, even better. Even better, page 47. So it's there, and it's great. There's wonderful examples and all that sort of stuff. So what I'm going to do is kind of hit the highlights. But then I want to spend some more time on the part of my conversation I didn't get to have last time, which is the personal dimension and connections that we make when we're making music together. So I'm trying to do some things this time that are a little more interactive and a little less me talking. And so we'll start with a little thing, okay? So you all have like a little writing pad or something, I was told, or you're about to get some more paper because I have some up here. And I'll tell you what I want you to do, and then John, my lovely assistant, will hand some papers out if you need one. So there's one thing I want you to do first, on one side, okay? And then I want you to write this, 100, okay? I was told I could write on this and not the walls. And so on one side, I want you to write the number 100, okay? And I'll tell you what that's about later, okay? On the back side, so on the opposite side of the 100, I want you to write a sentence or two, not more than 2 sentences, but just a sentence or two while you're involved in singing. And for some of you, if you're not in the chorale, you're probably a singer, or you're wanting to learn about singing, so that's why you're here. And so it doesn't have to be connected to the chorale, but it could be, right? So, and I'll just tell you on the front end, there's no wrong answers. So I just want you to write 2 sentences or so about why you're involved in singing, and then we're going to get to a point where we get back to this later on in the conversation. Okay, so the next chunk of this, we're going to do a really quick jump over the high parts of the historical background of choral music. And because last time I thought I had a crazy fool's errand to try to cover it all in 90 minutes. And this time it's even more a fool's errand, but I think we can kind of see where the goalposts are, as it were. Okay, so I bring this slide back up from last year where you see the timeline. And I'm kind of skipping over the medieval period. I'll talk a little bit about it, but not in great detail because we don't sing a lot of medieval choral music these days, right? So, the early origins, I kind of put this into perspective here, and this is, of course, all of this is in the book too, so you can refer back to it and look at some musical examples. But basically, as long as we've been able to talk, we've put our talking to pitch and sung. Right? And so it's old as language. And a lot of times the early choral singing was linked to certain ceremonies or rituals that were going on in society, either religious or otherwise. And then, of course, we trace a lot of music history back to the Greeks, where they made all of these discoveries and notational advances. And so in fact, Pythagoras, that we use with the Pythagorean theorem, our math people. Also, there's a funny story of him going around with these hammers and hitting different type hammers on different metal things and creating different pitches and then determining ratios, which some say that's some early music theory, and use those ratios to organize music. And then, of course, we have chant. And so the beginnings of the religious music was with chant. So I'm going to show you a little bit of examples of that too. We had these gilded and feudal societies, like I said. There were communal elements to singing, and so we had folk songs early on, right? And so these were really the earliest origins that we have. So this is a piece by Dunstable that's kind of, it's chant-like, particularly on the top voice part, and then you see what's called the tenor part, where it seems to be very slow. In fact, on the bottom line, which hopefully you can see, instead of a circle for a whole note, it looks like it's like an H, you know, with a hole and an H. That's called a brev. And generally it gets twice as long amount of time as a whole note, right? So this tenor part comes, in fact, the word tenor comes from the Latin word tenore, which means to hold. And so the first tenor part was the part that held the notes a long time, while the upper parts, in fact, the fact that there are two parts is significant here too, because we had chant that was monophonic, or one part, and then we're like, oh, somebody can hold a note underneath, and then we can ornament on the top. And so then you had two-part, organum is what it was called. And then the term polyphony that I have in the book is when you have multiple musical lines going on at the same time, so we call this early polyphony. Two-part and with a tenor part that holds, right? So I'll let you hear a little bit of this, of what it sounds like. And there's an example too. I think this is also Dunstable. Oh no, this is Perrotin on page 50. And Alleluia by Perrotin's three-part, but you still see the bottom line with the tenor line that just holds on page 50. It's not the same pieces up here, different composer, but kind of the same flavor, right? So let's see if this works. Yeah, so we're all going to walk out of here singing this Dunstable, obviously. See if I can pause it. So the other thing I'll point you to here, you see that sharp or natural above the staff? The early, we call chromaticism. You probably talked a little bit about that last week, or we'll talk about it. But sharps, flats, and natural signs, right, which we see in our music. This is the early way we saw this. It was above the staff, and it was called ficta, F-I-C-T-A, musica ficta. And so this is one of the early notational enhancements in music notation, which is fascinating. Okay, moving on. Let's see where we go next. The Renaissance. So we're jumping into a whole nother era, 1475, 1600. So if I had one thing that I'd want you to associate your mind with Renaissance music is line. Because music of this era was conceived or thought of horizontally, or in a line, right? And so as music got more and more complicated, they just had more lines stacked on top of each other. The other thing you might have noticed from the previous piece is there are no bar lines, right? In fact, the way we saw that notated would have been a bit foreign to the singers of the day, because they would have just had one big giant part book. It was not COVID friendly. Nothing about early singing was COVID friendly. In fact, they would stand around this giant part book and they'd all sing, like there'd be one soprano part book or a tenor part book, and they'd all stand around it and sing, and they couldn't see each other's parts, you know? And nowadays we get so, you know, as singers, we're just like doing our own thing, and sometimes we get off by a measure and we don't even know, and we have the other people's parts there, or we have the piano part. We have so much at our disposal these days that these early singers didn't have. So, but line is something I would want you to associate with Renaissance music. And then as time went by, they started to standardize or codify certain processes. Like, these are harmonies that are appropriate. And then 100 and 150 years later, they go, yeah, and now these are also appropriate, right? So the real nerdy people, like, well, not just me, but people that are smarter than me, could look at a piece from the Renaissance and tell you what 25-year window it comes from, and possible composers, because of the way they get to cadences or what types of chords line up. Not that they use chords, but what lines up. But as with all movements of the Renaissance, arts, literature, music, this emphasis on reason and thinking infiltrated music. In fact, nothing really, to me, in music happened in a bubble. It's all happening as a result of everything else that's happening culturally, artistically, intellectually, right? Even now, okay? And with great developments in notation, there was great enhancement of complexity. By the end, even by the end of the medieval period, some of the music that was notated was incredibly complex and would be hard for some of the best singers of today. So, and then what the great byproduct is, during this time, printing became a thing, right? So not only were we preserving music in print, but we're preserving poetry, text, mathematical treatises, treatises on anatomy, medicine. I mean, it's just fascinating. There's just, I guess, so much that people were discovering that then they were able to write it down, right? Okay, now I'm going to give you another piece. This is from the Coppell Chorale rep list. So my lovely assistant is indisposed at this time. Okay, so this piece is in the rep list. I can't remember where I got it out of Chorus Connection, so it may be variations, it may be the whole group, I don't know, but it's a fascinating piece. It's an English madrigal. Madrigals were a type of generally secular music of the Renaissance era that was very popular. You'd have Italian madrigals, English madrigals by composers like John Farmer and William Byrd. And basically, this was pop's music. I don't know, you try to tell me, who do you think is one of the most popular pop singers of today? Yeah, don't ask me. Okay, Taylor Swift. Fine. This was that cool. Okay, this was that cool. So I hand this out, and my kids go, why are you making us sing this old man? I'm like, this is the cool, hot stuff, y'all. Okay? And if you're really, duplicitous like I am, there are madrigals that are PG-13 and R that are just like, you would never give to high school kids. Okay? Now, this one is not too bad. It's talking about this girl that's feeding her flock, and she's and then there's a shepherd, and he's not knowing what's going on. Then they go they meet each other, and they wander down a hill, and they kiss, and all this. So it's basically PG, right? Of course, some junior high boy would make it into whatever rating he would, but it's a really great piece. Lots and lots of people sing it. But the first thing I notice, it's in the key of F. And usually if I can take an a cappella piece and take it out of the key of F, I do it. Because the key of F is hard to tune. So usually I would sing it in G or F sharp. If you have a really great accompanist, you just tell them, let's do it in F sharp. They'll look at this particular piece and they'll play it in F sharp. They don't like it, but they'll do it. Okay. Now, here's the thing. So we talked about polyphony, right? Multiple vocal lines at the same time. So the very first line, da, dee, da, 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 dee, da, 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 da. Then we have what's called homophony, where everything is happening at the same time, but not for long, because then when you get to the second ending, the sopranos go, the altos go, then the tenors go, then the bass goes, and then it's just all over the place. Hot mess, okay? Then you get to, measure 16, like the second to last measure of the second to last system at after her lover. then the sopranos and altos have a duet, and tenors and basses have a duet. It's basically like when the cheerleaders at the football game goes like this. Only in music, okay? And then they have all these sort of jagged, tapered entrances at the bottom and the repeats. And then at the very end, which is also frequent in Renaissance music, this sort of tempo change between, a pulse of 2 to a pulse of 3. Then they fell a-kissing, oh, then they fell a-kissing, oh, then they fell, then back to 2, ta, 2, ta, 2. Anyway, it's great. You think the Beatles is good? This was even cooler than that in England in 1565. So here we go. I have Beatles socks. Okay.
Feeding a flock near to a mountainside. Feeding her flock near to a mountainside. A shepherd knew not whither she was gone. But after her lover knew to slide, up and down he wandered, 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 up and down he wandered. But she was missing when he found her. Oh,
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1 and 2 and 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Up and down he wandered, up and down he wandered, up and down he wandered. But she was
A lot of up and down.
when he found her. Oh, then they fell a-kissing, oh, then they fell a-kissing, oh, then they fell a-kissing.
It's a great piece, yeah? So, so a great piece, and some of you, if they keep that in the packet, will get to do that this fall. The other, or whenever they do it. The other thing I'll tell you is notice they kind of just barely put the bar lines in. This is a pretty well-informed editor, and look, they didn't even put their name on it, sadly, but unless it's some tiny little thing that I missed. But they didn't put bar lines all the way from the top to the bottom, and that's, in essence, trying to be sensitive to the fact that singers of the day wouldn't have even perceived. It was all about line, right? Okay, so I'm going to skip this particular video, I think. I guess what I'll say to you is that you have held lines on the bottom and then incredibly complex upper voice parts, right? So I guess the reason I had this as a choice was because it showed some of the incredible complexity even at this point in music history, okay? Another Dunstable piece, it looks like. Okay, now moving on. Okay, now I'll talk about Palestrina real quick. So when people think of the climax of composition for vocal music in the Renaissance, they think of Palestrina. He was the composer. He even, people call his last name, and they know. The rest of his name is about 5 miles long, so I'll spare you all of that. But suffice it to say, you get to the end of the Renaissance period, and he was at the Sistine Chapel, so he had phenomenal singers. And so this is one of his pieces for 8 voices, double choir. And this is the day the Lord hath made, is the translation, Haec Dies. So I'll play a snippet of it, let you get a flavor of high Renaissance, and then we'll move to the next era. Line. And you see the ficta, the sharp above the staff. interest of time, I'm going to move on. But there's some really exquisite music in that era. If you're ever like me and your blood pressure gets a little high, this music is great for that. It's better than medicine. You just play it and it will calm you down. Stay away from, there's a Palestrina generally, because he was Catholic, so he had to play nice and follow the musical rules. So by and large, there's not a lot of dissonance, so it'll bring your blood pressure down. Fabulous stuff. If you try to sing it, though, it might raise it, because without the bar lines, you have to really be responsible and know your line, because it's hard to figure out and very easy to get off by a beat or two in a lot of this stuff. Okay, so I'm moving right along. We're getting to the Baroque era. So, and this is 1600, 1750. So, like I said, in the Renaissance period, we're thinking of music this way, right? This is why you get a doctorate, so you think of very complex things like music was this way, and then it went to be this way. And it didn't do that on January 1st, 1600. It slowly started to turn on the pendulum before 1600, and then continued to turn all the way until we get to the next era when it starts turning in other ways. But generally, we're thinking horizontally, right? We have cadences where we get to the end of a musical phrase and things line up, right? And in fact, there were treatises on harmony. This is the way we write these chords. These are the permissible dissonances. This is how certain things should be prepared, and so forth. Also, in addition to the harmonies and the melodies construction, we also had some codification of sectional divisions within music. So we have some complex formal structures. So the way I compare this in my simple mind is architecture, right? So I have a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house in Arkansas, okay? So there's certain building codes that say if you build a 3-bedroom, 2-bath house, you have to meet these standards with electricity, water. I should have had an inspection before I moved in, but that's a whole nother story. Some people follow the rules and some people don't. And then if you build some big, humongous building like this, musically, you still have codes to follow, right? And sometimes people followed them, sometimes people didn't. And so, but we started to have that. So we have fugues, preludes, suites, just throughout music in different forms. Baroque period, we also like opera started to become more and more of a thing, you know, where madrigals were the, you know, Beatles of the day, then it's like opera is the thing. It's the hot new thing that everybody's got to go see. Particularly the people with the money and power wanted to go see it. So instruments, just like in that last piece, even with Palestrina's writing, there may not be any instrumental parts, but there was somebody playing a trombone-type instrument on Sunday morning, and they were doubling some voice parts. Because you know what? Church musicians have to make it work. You don't know who's going to show up on Sunday, so you make it work. Okay? And then, the string section just elevates and becomes more and more important as we go through this. The other thing that's significant in the Baroque era is there was this idea that, like, I have an emotion. Like, I'm really happy. So this particular movement or piece is going to have one emotion, an affect, right? And so one of the expectations is that when you hear a movement of a piece, that it's going to be one emotional characteristic as opposed to a bunch of different ones, right? Which we get a little later on. And then with Baroque music, we generally get some pulsation, right? We have downbeats, clear downbeats. We have clear pulses within the beats. So that's some way when you're listening for music, like if NPR comes on and you're driving to work and you're going, wonder what this comes from. You can zero in on an era based upon some of these characteristics. Okay, moving on. So one of the, I may just kind of skip this. We'll see. I like to talk about Monteverdi because he would write in multiple styles. He basically wrote in an old style and a new style, partially because he wanted to get work. And, you know, musicians have to do what they have to get work. This is one of his more modern style pieces, and it's more Baroque style than modern style he wrote in. And generally, those had accompaniments, right? So if you hear an accompaniment part, but it sounds kind of early music. It may well be a Baroque piece. So this is a piece by Monteverdi from his Vespers. And I won't play the whole thing because we don't have time. But you see the accompaniment? Pretty complicated. Now, if I was Caroline, though, I wouldn't think it was too terribly complicated, because if you look at the accompaniment part's not that bad. Like, I'd be like, oh yeah, I'll start read that with y'all. If the singers come prepared. If the singers don't come prepared, I don't have nothing to do with this. And then of course we have Bach. We think of Bach, Handel, in the Baroque era, and Bach's music just took complexity to a whole new level. Johann Sebastian Bach. He wrote in all different types of genres, not so much operas, because he was a church musician. In fact, he had multiple churches he was responsible for. And one of the things that's just crazy about Bach is, and he was a Lutheran. Don't know if that rings true with many. But anyway, so what he did is he would write a cantata for every day of the church year, based on the scripture for that liturgical day of the year. And I think he has, like you have liturgical year A, B, and C, and he's got cantatas for every Sunday of that. And he had multiple church jobs, that he was over multiple choirs in multiple churches. It's just incredible, his output on the church side. But one of the things he would do is he would take a tune, that like a hymn tune or a familiar tune. Some even say, these Lutherans, some of their hymn tunes may well have been something that was sung at a bar, And so he never know the true origins of A Mighty Fortress. But he would take something like that everybody would hear the tune and know it, because they've sung it since they were wee little. And then he would write this just ornate counterpoint all around it, right? So here's a little example of that. People basically didn't know what they were going to get when they went to church. Anyway, incredible stuff. I mean, I don't know that anybody really after him has risen to that level of complexity. And I don't know that I blame composers as much as, people just don't have the stomach for that these days, and they're not as literate. It takes a lot to be able to read that level of complexity quickly, right? Yeah, sure. I got some time built in the end, but might as well. Mm-hmm. That's the end. Yep. I don't think that they were no, we know this is Bach's death year. The other eras, there might be some happenstance coincidence that it lines up. I don't know of a single composer that their death or birth year lines up with the change of an era like Bach. And that's not to say that you can't Google search and prove me wrong, but it's never been pointed out in my years of music study, where every time we get to this point, people point that out, right? So, and then he also had a lineage of children that started writing in a more classical style, right? So he does, I don't know that his music starts to sound classical, but certainly his children, right, or grandchildren, or relatives. So, but that's a good point, right? So now we're moving to classical period. So almost halfway to the end of this part of the evening. So we have chordal textures being like the palette of voice parts and things, right? Instead of having each independent vocal line being of equal importance with complex counterpoint, like what Bach did, In the classical period, composers like Mozart, Haydn, Beethoven, but really the first two, had soprano-dominated textures, which is to say melody-dominated. Don't know, depending on who you ask, we might still be living in that world. But it's definitely a change, right, from what came before, because before it was like everybody is of equal importance in terms of who gets the melody when, right? Also, we moved from, and you know, it's like, I feel this way as a parent. It's like you have this level of freedom, and then it gets abused. And then you lock them down. And then you think, they're doing good, so I'm going to start to go back this way a little bit. And oh, no, lock them back down, right? In music, it's this way, right? So composers would start, and you'd get over here, and they'd be like, oh, beautiful Renaissance polyphony, and then there'd be a push to simplify or to change. And then you get to the other side of this pendulum with Bach, inordinately complex, right? Not accessible. And then you'd go back this way towards something more simple and elegant, symmetrical balance. And you take away music, you put in art or architecture or any other movement in history, and it's the same concepts, right? It's just a different medium. So, yeah. I mean, you're not alone, okay? So, use of contrast between feelings and moods as opposed to just one, right? So, you think of Haydn, he'll go from loud to soft, happy to the depths of despair, and back, you know. And then generally very active string parts. So the string players get the really complicated flourishy stuff, while the choir may just sing chord, 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 right? Then, the patronage system. So this is a big thing in this time period. It's basically some wealthy person paid a musician to write things. They were an employer and an employee. And there wasn't a whole lot of like, wow, Mozart, what a gift to humanity. It was like, wow, Mozart, my servant, right? So we have this whole system that these artists are operating under. And a lot of the products that we have musically are a result of that system, right? Until we get to the end. And then the form structures that we created, we enhance, and we enlarge, and we develop. And then also instrumentation gets more complex. We have instruments we hadn't had before. We have a way to tune them. Hallelujah. Right? So the musical notation took advantage of those developments as you went through this era. Okay, music. So this is Haydn. He lived exclusively in the patronage system. Now, his system was a pretty nice one because the people that he had, he worked for Prince Esterhazy, court of Esterhazy. And so these, at least there was a grandfather who was really big about music, got Haydn very motivated. He died, his son, not so big on music, send him away. Go to London, enjoy. He got old, died, his kid loved music, back Haydn came and spent the rest of his career. But what was cool about it is he traveled. So he heard the music of Handel in London. He heard all these different things which influenced his writing. And he has lots of different types of pieces and so forth. This is the end of one of his masses he wrote at the end of his life, and you can hear some joy and excitement. It's pretty cool. And soprano. See active strings? Anyway, it's a wonderful piece of music. I was really silly, I'll tell you. I love that part. Anyway, I was silly enough to think, when I was a master's student, or I was interviewing at North Texas to do my master's, and they said, bring a piece that you want the choir to sight read on your audition, and you get to teach them for 10 minutes. And I chose that crazy piece you just heard. It was intense. think it's already starting the Beethoven. We'll make it stop. Bill. Okay, what did you say? Go ahead. Nelson. Maybe. England? Maybe so. A lot of these later Haydn masses had multiple names. There was like a mass in the time of war, the mass to the patron saint of music. Basically, whatever they told him the dedication would be, I imagine is what he did. But it very well could have been. So then you have Beethoven, and Beethoven's great because he'll transition us into the next era, okay? Because he sort of, if you go to half-price books or Amazon and you buy a book on music history, who knows, 50% of them will put Beethoven squarely in the classical era, 50% of them put him squarely in the romantic era, and some people like me hedge their bets and say he's a little of both, right? And so he actually marks the movement away from the patronage system. He wrote because he wanted to, because he was motivated. He may well have still had commissions, but there's a difference between somebody saying, well, you write this one piece and you are my servant, right? So with him, he would write these really complex long, he has this one mass that the Gloria is 20 minutes long, right? My teacher at North Texas, who was the Dallas Symphony chorus director, would say, oh man, when they say we're going to do the Missa Solemnis of Beethoven, I just cringe. Because he's like, how am I going to teach all that? Right? And then another thing was, like, it's nothing for Beethoven to have the soprano sing in high Cs. Yeah, in fact, so he wrote the Ninth Symphony. His Ninth Symphony, you probably all heard snippets of at some point in your life. It's the first symphony to have choral singing and vocal soloists. Well, the very last movement, it's like high C, high C, high C, high C, high C, and he was deaf when it was premiered. And the story is that they just moved their mouths. They didn't sing the upper pitches because he couldn't hear, right? And he certainly couldn't hear any of those sopranos complaining about what he did to them, or he wouldn't have done it. But this is a great piece. The Mass in C that he wrote in the style of these Haydn late masses, but what is really fascinating about it is the opening tempo marking was like this long. Nobody can make sense of it except for him because he's the genius, and I think that's the whole point. Is the composer is a really brilliant human who should be revered and not just a servant, right? And it's a gorgeous piece. I don't probably have time, so I won't play it for you. The Romantic period, starting around 1820 and runs through 1900 or so. This is where composers you'll see write 4 Ps, 5 Ps, and then 5 Fs, and everything in between, right? And then they'd go, oh, so we'd write a fugue, and your fugue would be, or you'd have the opening movement of a symphony in sonata allegro form. Fine, I'll start in sonata allegro form, and then I'll do whatever the heck I want for 15 minutes after that, right? Prominence of melody and increased lyricism. So not only is the melody important, but the lyrical quality of it is even more important. Instrumental and architectural developments allow for larger orchestras. So concert halls, right? We went from the palace being the cultural center in the classical era to the concert hall, right? And these concert halls were made more and more and more large to accommodate larger forces. And then we have starting to have divergent paths, right? So you'd have nationalistic music. You'd have some more conservative type classical style composers, and then some that were really pushing the envelope in terms of these dimensions. And longer durations of pieces, composers writing for the sake of the art rather than for a patron, which we talked about, and I talked about concert halls. The other thing you see abandoned altogether was some forms like the mass structure. You'd have, for instance, with Mozart, a requiem mass that followed all the precedents of the past. You get to Brahms in this era, you go, a requiem mass in German, not Latin, and I choose the text, right? Because I can. And so it's phenomenally good music, right? So I mean, Charles Ives in the modern era was an insurance salesman by day. So, I mean, I think there was still a level of commission work going on, most likely, but it wasn't the driving force, you know. Okay, so we had conservative romantics, and I left this particular video in because it was my choir, okay? On page 63 of the book is a part of this piece. In fact, it's the very beginning of the piece you'll hear. Mendelssohn, I put him in the conservative romantic camp because a lot of his music is very, very singable. You might confuse it for a classical piece, not so much a Baroque piece, but he would write in these beautiful 8-part textures that sound like really complicated, but really are just very accessible, and it goes where your ear thinks it's going to go, right? You know, all of you have had those pieces, you look in front of you and you sing your voice part and you think, man, this does what I thought it was going to do. And then sometimes you get handed a piece and you look at it and you go, man, that is not what I thought was going to happen on my voice part, right? And so with Mendelssohn, it's definitely predictable. Time. But that was the dang good choir, Coppell High School, Southwest ACDA. Oh, the red vests. I had great kids in that choir. I had great kids the whole time I was at Coppell. Okay, so then you have the envelope pushers, right? And Berlioz is a romantic composer who definitely pushed the envelope in all respects. And this is a piece of his music that was kind of found after he died. I'll let you hear a bit of it. Like, may fast forward it a little bit to get to the choral stuff. Piece of music. No, I'm gonna move on. What year was that? Oh, that's old. It's got to be from. This was probably the premiere because they found it in like the 90s, and they found it like in an organ bench. And they found it in an organ bench, and then they premiered the work, even though he had been dead, in like the 90s. And this very well may have been the premiere, because that conductor was the one that premiered it. So it's probably 90s, I would think early to mid 90s. Okay, moving on, almost done with this part of it. So the modern era, 1900, we have expansion beyond formal structures of the past. And in fact, we abandon tonality. Some composers altogether abandon harmony. Good luck if you sing some of that stuff. Some of my choirs would just abandon harmony, but it was not because of the composer. That's a different conversation. That's week 3 and 4. Come back for that. Okay, so some composers look back to previous things like neo-Baroque or neoclassical, where they take some of those stylistic concepts, but then put it within a modern harmonic context. So like you have composers like Stravinsky, and Debussy, impressionistic, expressionistic, and then some I already talked about that, so that's great. Or not only do they have tonality, they have multiple. So you'll see a piece that has 2 or 3 different key signatures. And this is a piece, I'm not going to play it because I don't have time, but it's by Vaughan Williams, and it's a nationalistic piece. He's known for folk music, hymnody, and nationalistic type music, and his stuff is just beautiful, but I'm skipping it. And he's a handsome devil with a nice part. I'm going to skip because I don't want to run out of time for other stuff. I talked about the spiritual last year, and I want to show a little bit of this video because it's wonderful. But in American choral music, we have the African American spiritual, and it's just so rich. And what we're learning now is that we shouldn't just take a spiritual and throw it onto the end of a concert, right? Because just to get applause at the end. We should really try to be true to the meaning of those particular pieces and really do the research that you would on a piece by Bach or any other composer in a way that respects that heritage. But all this to say, we have videos of some of the most revered spiritual arrangers and composers that we can watch. And one of them is Chester Hairston. And this is a video of him talking about his piece, Amen. That's an African-American spiritual. So I wanted to let you hear him talk because he's funny. And then I'll let you hear a little bit of his spiritual.
This next song is my favorite.
Well, I'm going to make it full screen.
First, now I'll show you when to come in. The last verse, he says, led before Pilate, then they crucified him, but he rose on Easter. And to me, a Christian, that's what the shout is all about, the risen Christ, you see? So now you come in, but here's what we do. The piano, the whole choir, all, we modulate every 2 verses, we modulate a step higher.
So he talks about his piece, and then he sings it. I'll let you hear a little bit of it. It's just incredible. If I had a video of Bach to watch, people would just go crazy. But we have these resources, and we sometimes, as choral directors, we don't take advantage of them as much as we should. But Chester Hairston, phenomenal, one of many phenomenal people. I'll tell you, when I first started singing to now, I've gone from this side of the pendulum about it being about the music to this side of the pendulum about it being about the people, right? In an educational context, that looks a little different than it does in a chorale organization like this or in, a church context. But I don't remember, I can vaguely remember my first chorale concert. I know we did Randall Thompson Choose Something Like a Star, but I can't remember much of the repertoire. But I can still remember a lot of the stories and memories of the people I was with, And we get to connect in such a beautiful way as choir members and get to share part of each other's lives. And it's just a really special thing that we get to do. So what I want you to do is share. Now, how many of you, though, where I was going with the people, non-music thing, how many of you thought about things that weren't musical when you went to write things down, but you thought maybe Dr. Brown wants to just hear music stuff? Yeah, okay. So, hey, it's all right. So take a minute or so and share what you wrote down. And then if you get real bold, I may take a couple of people to share with the full group. It's all great. There's no wrong answer, but it's just so much more than notes on a page, whatever it means to you. And the other thing is, our answers may change over time. right? The reason we come in and do this may change over time. On page 66, I wrote some beautiful things, and it's by no means comprehensive, but it lays out some things, and I'm not going to read it nor have it read, but what I'll pull out are a couple of things. One of the dangers of choral music is to get up on a stage and perform really beautiful things. People hear it, go, that was pretty, and then leave, and have no point of connection to what's going on, right? It kind of creates what I called in there a museum culture of like, I'm an artistic bystander. I walk and I see it. Oh, that's nice. And I move on, right? Not to say that beauty is not important. We need it. But we have so much more to offer as artists and musicians. For us, we have an advantage over our instrumental counterparts because we have text. And so if we can have text that connects with people, in a church setting, it's a religious text, a psalm setting, or what have you, biblical text, or whatnot. In the chorale, a lot of times, it's because it's a really great pops tune that people know and they like. They like singing Beatles, so we're going to have something there for those people. We're going to have some people that like Broadway. We're going to have something for people like a little bit of classical, little something in there for everybody. And I really think from the St. All Choir, the Dallas Symphony, you know, every choir in existence has to have something in it for everybody, whether they know it or not, and have to frame it in that way. The other thing is, you know, there's an awful lot of sacred repertoire I played tonight that makes up the body of the historical canon, right? But I don't think that somebody necessarily has to be an uber religious person to connect with spiritual dimensions of music making, right? So whatever our point of entry, as long as we have some kind of way to connect, it's so important. Like, to me, I'm not a Catholic, all right? I'm a Protestant Christian. So, like, Ave Maria's, I don't sing in church, but I'll sing in Mozart Ave Maria any day because it's glorious and masterfully constructed, right? And I can find some artistic and spiritual elements to being a part of that kind of music as well, even though I don't connect to that in the same way a practicing Catholic would. Like I said, you know, we like to sing what we like to sing, so there may be, you know, a country music piece that you like, and that's great. The other thing is, I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this as a director, we miss times to share our thoughts with the music, right? Like, we joke about my story times, but I think there should be some story times that aren't just the director, you know, like if there could be time. Now, rehearsal time is so precious and you want the music to be as strong as it can be. So sometimes that means maybe you as a singer, you have to go have a sidebar conversation during a break and say, hey, look, I did this piece, I did this Handel piece way back in the day or whatever, I know this or whatever. And your piece of context may inform somebody else's experience with it as well. So that's kind of the Reader's Digest version of what I wrote in there for that. I would love to be able to do the most complex choral music on the planet, but I don't know that choral music should be relegated to professionals or people who spend all day or get multiple degrees. You know, I think you can have a rich experience. This chorale is a testament to this, is that you can have a rich experience making music together and not have to have advanced degrees or do uber complicated, stodgy art music, you know? But it is a very personal thing when we share our voice. And then when we do it with one another, it's an incredible gift. And I just put places in this book. I hope it will be an encouragement to you and a jumping off point that maybe if you're at a place where you've been involved in the chorale for a while, that you find ways to dig in deeper, or if you haven't tried being in the chorale yet, this group is a great group to start because they're encouraging and the music is a lot of fun and it's a great jumping off place, you know, and you may get in there and love it and do it forever, right? But one of my teachers, and I got to see him this past week, he just turned 82, 1 or 2. When he was cleaning out his office, and I was his grad assistant, he would give me all this stuff, books, music, everything. And he'd look through different things as we were cleaning out his office. He said, I don't hear the music or think about the music. I think about the people that I got to do that piece with, and the places we went together and the experiences we had. And so that stuck with me, and I think that's true of anything that you all do too. So as much as I encourage you to be picky about the musical details, it's just as important to invest yourself in the community of the people you make that music with, and to have fun as part of it. What I will also say before I turn it over, I have one last video I'll play you. But I'll say this, it is just wonderful to be back here. And I never got to make a note in this art center. But we're planning on, we have a conspiracy theory for the month of October where I may get to rectify that. So, I'll go make a note in the art center. Okay, good. Yeah. That was also by the Beatles. Okay. So anyway, I'll play this video, and this will be how I end. And I told you it was Eric Whitacre. So here's Eric Whitacre.
There are so many good things about choral music that it's kind of stunning that it's not required in educational situations. To begin with, in an ensemble, you learn compassion, you learn empathy, you learn discipline, you learn languages, you learn history, you learn focus. All of these things that are essential for every other part of your life, all these other parts of the study, every one of the letters in STEM, you learn through that. Ensemble music making in general. But with choral music, you get the addition of language, right? So that you're now starting to sing and think about the great questions of the human mystery. Why are we here? What are we doing? What is love? What is death? Children. You start to build a sense of an ethical foundation through the art that you're singing and that you're internalizing. Then, on top of that, there is study after study that shows the health and well-being benefits of singing. Right? We know now that just singing together in a group reduces the stress hormone cortisol, it releases endorphins, it causes a sense of joy and euphoria, it creates a bonding within the physiological bonding chemical that happens within the people in the room. And now there are even studies that show that singers who sing together tend to sync heartbeats. Their heartbeats actually begin to sync. Now, we don't know yet if that's because they're just breathing all at the same time. If it's homophonic music that does it, if polyphonic music does it. But there's just no question that there's this physiological component to what we're doing as well. And also, you're singing, you're breathing, it's just good. Then there's the social aspect of it, which again, studies, hard data shows that social environment is essential for a sense of well-being, for a sense of building community, empathy, compassion. So I feel that with the data, with the anecdotal evidence, and just a sense of humanity, I can't imagine how educators don't say, this is the way we start our days. We start our days with singing, and then everything else actually rolls out in this really lovely way. But this is the core of who we are and what we need to be.
And you're on time.
On time.
Oh my goodness.
Whoa.
You can tell he's got his doctorate now. He's on time. So.